Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, September 25th, where we are putting some closure onto Frankenstein, getting ready to move ahead to Edgar Allan Poe, and also thinking about our first paper. So, as you know, I have distributed some paper topics, and that said, whether or not you want to choose to write on one of the texts and related to the Emily Dickinson quote, or you decide to write on your own topic, I thought it would be useful, and of course, you should get that topic approved by me if you are going to be writing on your own topic. Thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about the conventions of writing a paper, which I hope is basically review at this point in your academic career. But you might notice that in our syllabus and other documents folder, I have uploaded a handout entitled The Critical Paper that I wanted to talk about today. And there is a story with this handout. Actually, this was a handout that was distributed to me when I was an undergraduate student, eons ago, it feels like. And it's still one of the best that I've seen in terms of reviewing how to write a paper. So there are a few places in there that might seem a little dated. I'll point them out to you. But on the whole, I think it's a great way to think about how to write a paper. And certainly, you've got up until the midpoint of the semester to submit in your first paper. That said, I always encourage rolling deadlines and that you submit in your paper earlier rather than later. And certainly by the midpoint of the semester, if you haven't submitted in a paper, now I'm getting a bit nervous. So you would want to talk to me by that point. And you might have already decided that you do want to write your paper on Frankenstein. I do suggest, however, that you wait until we talk about a particular text before you start actually seriously composing. So if you're thinking about Edgar Allan Poe, my suggestion would be to wait over the next couple of classes to see if any of the conversations that we have about Poe are useful to you for your paper. And after Edgar Allan Poe comes Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And all of those are possibilities for the paper. As I had indicated, Dracula sort of straddles both the first and the second part of the semester. So I think it would make sense to save Dracula for paper number 2, because what you will be doing with paper number 2 is very similar to what you're doing with paper number 1. And I see paper number 1 as a learning exercise. All of you have the opportunity to rewrite that paper for a higher grade if you would like to do so. And then you would just be basically trying to replicate the same sort of writing with paper number 2, just with one of the later texts of the semester. So the critical paper handout that I was talking about divides things up into 3 categories in terms of putting together an academic analysis. The first is planning, the second is writing, and the third is presentation. And I can tell you right now that most students and writers skip the first part, planning, go straight to the writing section. They wait too long. They wait until the paper or the assignment is just about due. So they have to hurry the writing section, so much so that they don't have any time for editing. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about writing the paper now, because I wanted you to spend some time in the planning section. The worst thing you can do as a writer is just to write the perfect first sentence, or to try to write the perfect first sentence. Because what ends up usually happening is you waste a lot of time and you become quite frustrated. And then you have to hurry everything because you were trying to create something that was perfection rather than thinking about ideas first. And that's the planning stage, is that you should be trying to generate ideas. Whether you brainstorm those ideas, I like list format myself, or whether you decide to journal, which is kind of like a diary, but you keep an informal response, not to your personal life, but to what you're reading. Whether you decide just to gather important quotes and then to organize those quotes in the order in which you think you might want to discuss them, and then begin to write paragraphs around those quotes. I would oftentimes utilize that technique when I was writing a paper. But regardless, remember that your job is to analyze, not to summarize, so assume the reader has familiarity with the text. You only need to review or summarize those pieces of the text that are necessary for your particular argument. Or a fancy way of saying that is confine your comments on plot to subordinate clauses, emphasizing the main clause or the main section of the sentence, the significance of that action. Now, you need to begin with the strong thesis. That's usually something that we put in the opening paragraph. And the thesis is one of the hardest things to write because how do you know what your paper is about until you've written it? And it's quite possible that you could do some writing and not start with a thesis, review what you've written, summarize it in a sentence or two, make that your thesis and plug it into the introduction. So you can work backwards because part of writing a paper is a process of discovery. So regardless, you should have a sentence or two that basically takes a position that reasonable people could disagree with. I've oftentimes used the analogy of a courtroom attorney who's basically putting together evidence to support a position, and a good attorney can argue guilty or innocent, defense or prosecution with the same evidence. Obviously, the evidence might be stronger on one side rather than another, but a good attorney knows how to present the evidence so that it sounds convincing. And that's basically what you're doing in effect. And my job is basically to take the opposite position of whatever it is you're saying. Doesn't matter what I believe or what I've said in class. And the reality is that you just need to provide enough evidence, usually paraphrase and quotation, in order to be able to support your particular position so that it's possible. It doesn't even have to be probable. So the thesis implies some sort of interpretive conclusion about that work, and you want to make sure that it's specific enough so that it's meaningful. So you don't want to say something like, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. The reality is that all authors and all texts that are literary explore the complexities of experience. You haven't said much of anything. Or saying something like Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet, the response from the reader is probably going to be, yeah, so what? What imagery is employed and how and why is it important? So what you're doing is you're constructing paragraphs. And by definition, an academic paragraph, and remember, we're engaging in academic writing, the same sort of writing that you would use in the workplace. So we're not talking about journalism, for instance, which has different criteria. But a paragraph should be minimum 3 sentences long. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So anything less than 3 sentences is not a paragraph. That said, your paragraph is probably multiple sentences long. The whole point of a paragraph is that it deals with one idea. And a well-written paragraph has what we call a topic sentence, the first sentence of the paragraph that basically summarizes what the paragraph is about. So in theory, if something is well written, you can read the first sentences of all the paragraphs and have a kind of outline, something that you might want to test with your own writing or perhaps with someone else's. You might even want to try that with a textbook, for instance, though textbooks are notorious for not necessarily being well written. So that said, you want to remember what the point of a paragraph is. It's just to break up the text so that it's easier for the reader to be able to comprehend and dissect what it is you're saying. So the topic sentence could be broad. The topic sentence could be specific. When you think about your average paragraph, you've probably encountered paragraphs that are anywhere between maybe 5 to 15 sentences on average, and that's probably what you want to aim for. But I can't give you a specific number outside of saying anything less than 3 sentences is not a paragraph. And again, your job is to provide support, which is evidence from the text, whether it be paraphrase, put things in your own language, or direct quotation. And you want to avoid extremes. So you don't want to submit in a paper with no quotation, but you also don't want to submit in a paper with too much quotation. And usually it sounds like what you're trying to do is pad the paper and just add quotation, add length. So when I say approximately 4 to 5 pages long, I mean approximately. The paper should be as long as it needs to be. Better to have a shorter, well-written paper than a longer paper that could basically be reduced because it is repetitious or it's wordy. And a lot of what I do when I review a paper is just deleting things, whether it's something that's already been stated or something that's been stated in many words that can be stated in fewer words. And that's a general rule of thumb that we'll talk about in terms of writing, to try to be as concise as possible. Um, Again, thinking about ending paragraphs, I wouldn't, and it's generally suggested that you not end the paragraph with a quotation. Of course, you can break all of these rules, but usually we comment on the relevance of a quote, which is what you would want to be doing. So you probably wouldn't want to end the paragraph in a quote. And then you need to have a concluding paragraph, which means that a paper also needs to have the rule of three, so to speak. An introductory paragraph, a body paragraph, and a concluding paragraph. Though chances are you want a lot more than that. You might have heard of the 5-paragraph essay, which is fine. 3 pieces of evidence in the middle with an introduction and conclusion. But usually the 5-paragraph essay is pretty simplistic. Why not 6 paragraphs or 8 paragraphs? So, don't limit yourself to the idea that the 5-paragraph essay is the only way to write an essay. So, the conclusion can be challenging because you're tired and you've said everything, so you want to save a little bit of energy. Perhaps you can relate the conclusion to contemporary times, whatever your thesis happen to be. You can restate your thesis from the introduction, but you don't want to just recopy your introduction. You could perhaps relate your conclusion to another work by the same author, or perhaps a similar work by another author. So the writing section, as I had indicated, the first principle of good writing is economy, and the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. In other words, go through your writing and ask yourself, as you are reading each sentence, can I say the sentence in fewer words and not sacrifice meaning? And if so, you're generally better off doing so. So that means, again, that your paper is going to be shorter, but better that it be shorter and well written. So usually when instructors talk about length, they're talking about length in terms of ideas, not necessarily length in terms of word count, using language that's unnecessary. Use strong verbs and nouns. Action words and nouns are people, places, things, or ideas. Adjectives and adverbs, descriptive words, can be helpful, but you don't want to overuse them to pad your paper just to add length. The active voice as opposed to the passive voice. So you want it to be really clear that the subject of the sentence and the subject of the sentence is the thing or the person that's engaging in an action. That the subject of the sentence is directly engaged in the action rather than the action happening to them. So if we were to take 2 simple sentences such as Lillian graded the papers, or the papers were graded by Lillian, the preferable sentence would be Lillian graded the papers. That would be active because it's very clear that the subject of the sentence, Lillian, is engaged in the action of grading. As opposed to the second section, or second example, the papers were graded by Lillian. It's almost as if the action was happening to Lillian rather than Lillian engaging in it. Or if that just seems too complex, just do a simple word count. Lillian graded the papers as 4 words. The papers were graded by Lillian 6 words. It doesn't seem like a lot, but again, if you go through each sentence and you reduce unnecessary language, you end up with a tighter piece of writing. So, vary your sentences. There should be some long sentences and some short ones. Too many long ones, it's dense and hard to read. Too many short ones, it sounds choppy. You want to vary your sentence beginnings, so you don't want multiple sentences starting in the same way, especially if they are near or next to one another. Avoid cliches and trite expressions. These expressions that are considered to be overused and don't have any originality. And what's interesting about that is that oftentimes some of these cliches are actually expressions that were first created by Shakespeare, but they've become quoted so frequently that they now are, in effect, considered cliches. In other words, we're quoting Shakespeare all the time. We may not even realize it. That said, better to say something like, it's raining heavily rather than it's raining cats and dogs, let's say. Imagine if English was not your first language, trying to understand how cats and dogs are related to rain, or why it is that cats go before dogs in that expression. It makes no sense. And that's usually the reason why we want to avoid cliches and trite expressions. It's a greater possibility of misunderstanding. So we want to have some standardization of language. And I always give a true life story to sort of illustrate this point, that this isn't just something that is random and that is subjective. There are good reasons for trying to avoid cliches or trite expressions or slang. Informal language, usually language that's created by one group to exclude another. Take adolescents, for instance. They usually create new slang every generation, and sometimes the slang goes mainstream, true. But my true story, to sort of illustrate how it's possible for greater misunderstanding, is a news event that happened in the 1990s. It was quite a while ago. And basically, it was a second language student who was going to a party. He went to the wrong home, a home that had been burglarized previously. So the owner, shall we say, was nervous. Student knocked on the door, and the owner opened the door, and the student asked if this is where the party was happening. Owner responded with some slang that most, if not all of you, know. The owner said freeze, which means to halt. But of course, if you were to look up the word freeze in a dictionary, it would talk about a change in temperature or a liquid becoming a solid. For whatever reason, the student took a step forward. Perhaps he misheard, perhaps he misunderstood. The result was that the owner took out the gun that he always carried and shot it off and killed that student on his doorstep. And I tell this story in all of my classes. So if you're a returning student, you've heard this story before. And the reason why I tell this story is because I think it's a really good illustration of how misunderstanding can escalate. And we want to have some sort of standardization of language so that there's less possibility of misunderstanding. That in no way, it eliminates the idea that you need to know the language of the streets, if you will, in order to be able to interact with other people. But when we're talking about formal writing, we usually have a certain level of standardization. So you're avoiding cliches and you're avoiding trite expressions. And you are maintaining the present tense, which I know is going to be very counterintuitive because all these texts were written in the past. And also, we talked about them in the past. And that said, you should talk about the text as if the events were unfolding in the present rather than the events occurring in the past. So it's not that Victor said, it's that Victor says to the creature. So if this becomes a little bit too difficult for you, then ultimately what I suggest is in the proofreading stage, you go through and you change everything that you might have put in the past tense into the present tense. So the last piece after the writing piece is the presentation. Ideally, you would put away your writing and not look at it, not think about it, so that you can sort of get some distance from it, so that when you return to it to proofread it, you're reading it with a fresh perspective. At the very least, you should try to get away from your writing for a few hours. A few days is better. If you have difficulty concentrating when you proofread, try reading backwards. So start from the end and work to page 1. Obviously, the argument won't make sense because what you're focusing on are the sentences themselves. And you need to have a title. The title should be original to your writing. So you don't want to call your paper Frankenstein, for instance. That title's already been taken. You can use, however, the title of a text and include that within your own title. So if you wanted to talk about something like the hauntings in Frankenstein, certainly you could do that. And usually what we do is if something has been published, if it's a longer work, let's say a novel, for instance, it's either underlined or italicized. If it's a shorter work, let's say a short story, for instance, Edgar Allan Poe's works, they're put in quotation marks. So you should utilize that format. Your own title does not need to be underlined or put in quotation marks because you haven't published it yet. But if you are referencing a short story, then you should put the title of that short story in from your title in quotation marks. And if you're referencing a novel, then you should either underline it or italicize it. So, identify the author and the work someplace in the first paragraph, because in the first paragraph, the reader should know what your thesis is and who the author is and what the work is that you are discussing. And this is the place where you can see that this handout is a bit dated when it says instructors prefer typewritten papers. It does have to be typed. Double space, 1-inch margins. This is according to the standards of the MLA, the Modern Language Association. It's the professional organization for writers in the humanities and languages, and this includes us. Hopefully this is something you've talked about in previous classes, though we'll revisit the MLA in further classes to talk a little bit about the conventions for quotation and documentation. Now, according to the MLA, a title page is not necessarily required. It's based on the preference of your instructor. This instructor would like a title page. A title page is just a separate sheet of paper, or in this instance, a separate screen that lists your name. That's important. My name, the due date, the paper number, and of course your paper title. All of this in terms of the formatting of the paper is in the syllabus when you see the section about papers, but it's also something that you can find in other resources. Perhaps you've got a style book from another class, or I also have some suggestions for you about some websites that might be useful. So if you were to look at the notes below under the critical paper, you can see that basically I've reviewed most of those pieces. I don't think I talked about the fact that punctuation helps to just clarify meaning. Ultimately, when we are speaking, we vary our vocal inflections. So think about the difference between saying sit down as opposed to saying sit down. And while you can see that I've changed my vocal inflection, you wouldn't know that when you were reading. So a question mark would be sit down as opposed to a period, which would be sit down. And that, oh, yes. Try to avoid contractions. There's debate about this. Contractions is when you take two words and, in effect, you make them into one. So two words like do not and make them into don't, or will not and won't, things of that nature. We use it all the time when we speak, but it's considered to be a little bit more informal. So say do not, will not. And avoid I. The idea of writing the paper is that this is an academic analysis, so that you don't have to say, I think that the creature is isolated. You can just say the creature is isolated. It's also more concise as well. And if that's also difficult for you to do, wait until the proofreading stage and then just eliminate all the references to yourself. But the two websites that I recommend that talk a little bit about the conventions of writing, you might have heard of Purdue OWL. It's from Purdue University, and they've made it accessible to everyone. It's free. You don't have to be a student at Purdue. It goes through the entire writing process. Great website. Another great website is our own website in the GCC library. And specifically, I put the link that will talk a little bit about writing and citation, because the library is well aware that you're going to be writing papers in school and that you are going to need to be citing. So those are two great resources as well. And that critical paper, the focus is on your interpretation. You're not using outside resources based on what you've learned from class and your classmates. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about the paper. We still have to talk about quoting. I'm looking at the time. This was taking a little bit longer than I thought it would. I hope it wasn't too dry and repetitious, particularly if you've done this in other classes. And I hope it wasn't too fast and confusing if you've never done this before. But certainly you can ask me questions. And what I think I'll do is just sort of save my summary comments for Frankenstein for next class. And then we can begin with Edgar Allan Poe. You can see in the notes below that I have included the links for the short stories that we'll be doing over the next couple of classes. And that means that next class I'll also be including the link for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the event that you don't have a paper copy, so that you can begin reading earlier. What's left basically is our attendance question, which would be due on our discussion forum on the 27th. And as you know by this point, you're not required to respond to your classmates, though I certainly encourage it. But you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. Give you a good idea of what we would have talked about during class discussion. And it makes sense considering that since today was about paper number 1, that I ask you about paper number 1. At this point, what questions, if any, do you have about paper number 1? If you don't have a question, just say no questions, and that's fine, and that'll count for your attendance. So next class, we'll put some closure onto Frankenstein, and we will begin with Edgar Allan Poe. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will see each other soon, so to speak. Take care. Bye-bye.